travelers, and well met, and welcome back to Markers and Monsters. We've got a giant, barbarian-sized finale to our month-long look at cold weather chillers. Today, after a recent snowstorm, I thought I'd go back and visit one of my all-time favorite fantasy characters, Conan the Barbarian. I'm a huge fan, you guys, and so I thought that this deserved to be a massive, huge finale. As you can see, I'm working at a larger scale than normal. This is an 8x10 piece of paper here, actually a 9x12, and I've trimmed it to 8x10, which doesn't sound that big, but trust me, when you get into it, when you're actually doing the artwork, it's a lot of space to fill. But anyway, as you can see, I'm penciling in the figures here. The frost giants, Conan there coming over the ridge on the left side, and then of course the titular frost giant's daughter, which I'm penciling in now. I'll change her pose probably like 4 or 5 times throughout this video, so don't get too attached until it's done. Interestingly enough, I thought that I wanted to give this a painterly look, kind of like a lot of my favorite fantasy painters like Boris of Leo and Frank Frazetta, who does tons of awesome Conan work. So to that extent, I'm going to be inking in first. Pretty soon here, as soon as his pencil drawing's kind of done, you'll see I'm going to go in with the inks. I'm actually going to mix up a little bit of purple, a little bit of blue, and just a dab of black to make it nice and opaque, and go in with that. And then we're going to marker on top. We'll give it a little bit more of a painterly quality, which I like. And also the ink work here is going to be a little more in-depth than normal, with texture and tone and stuff like that. But you guys didn't come here to hear me talk about drawing. You guys came here to hear me talk about Conan. So let's get into it. Like I said, I am a huge fan of Conan. The 1982 Schwarzenegger Conan movie is quite possibly my favorite movie of all time, of any genre. I love it. I've seen it probably hundreds of times. It's phenomenal, even though it's not quite like the Conan books and novels and the original source material. I know that's a big point of contention for a lot of people. Fair enough. But I still like the movie just as much as I like the books, even though they're a different thing, even though it's a different breed. Of course, today we're talking about the Frost Giant's Daughter, which is based on one of the Conan short stories. If you don't know the history of Conan, he was created by Robert E. Howard, a writer from Texas, way back in the 1930s, in the age of pulp. That's when you get figures like the Shadow or the Phantom initially came around, stuff like that. Pulp magazines publish all kinds of different types of stories, usually fantasy, science fiction, horror, detective, stuff like that. Howard was looking for a good character to write. He had written before and came up with Conan the Barbarian from the lost Hyborian age. That's an age set before, essentially, our modern world. It's essentially on like a Pangea-like continent. It has all kind of things: jungles, deserts, frozen wastelands, all that kind of stuff. Conan is, of course, from Samaria, a far northern country filled with loose tribes of barbarians, essentially. Now, this story, The Frost Giant's Daughter, was the second official Conan story that Howard had ever written. That's not counting the poem Samaria about Conan's homeland, or a story called People of the Black Circle, which features a barbarian named Conan, but not the same Conan the Barbarian we all know and love. Frost Giant's Daughter would never see publication in its true form, essentially, during his lifetime. He eventually rewrote the story with the same basic premise, but with different characters. That's all publication, but the official Conan story would never see print in its final form until the 70s. That's the form Howard initially intended it to be presented in. So that's quite a ways off. Luckily, it is pretty much the version you can get if you pick up any Conan collection, and I recommend you do, especially the Del Rey Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. There's 3 books in this series, with the Coming of Conan being the first one. And it collects all of Howard's Conan stories in the order that they were written in, along with like maps, fragments of stories that he never finished are in the back, introductions by people, and illustrated wonderfully throughout. I absolutely can't recommend that Del Rey version of the Conan stories enough. Pretty terrific, you guys. Now, the Frost Giant's daughter, pardon me, interestingly enough, too, even though it was a second story written, it's canonically, or not canonically, but what people interpret as being the first Conan story chronologically. Howard often described writing Conan stories as like he was sitting in a bar and Conan would come in and say, "Hey, ever tell you about the time that I did this?" Or, "Hey, remember that time that, I was a king and had to go fight this dragon dude? An undead mummy came back because a cabal of wizards wanted to overthrow me. Remember that?" And so the stories were all kind of out of order and just like whatever came into his head. Sometimes he was a king, sometimes he was young, sometimes he was in the desert, sometimes he was a pirate, whatever. So smarter minds than me have figured out like a rough chronology, essentially, saying, oh yes, this would have been the first story. This is when Conan is younger. And oh yes, he would have traveled from this place next to this place. So these two stories are chronologically next to each other. Frost Giant's Daughter is what most people say is the first Conan story. It's the only story in which Conan is a southerner because he leaves Samaria and travels north, and he's hooked up with the Aesir. There are two countries above Samaria, and he hooks up with the Aesir, one of them. Their enemies, the Vanir, they're at war with. Conan hooks up with a war band, and pretty much the entire band of Aesir has been killed when the story begins. Same with the Vanir that they're fighting. There's only two people left, Conan and a Vanir named Heimdall, who Conan quickly dispatches and kills, leaving Conan the only survivor on this basically tundra filled with corpses, when suddenly a woman appears to him. She is beautiful. Her beauty is blinding and almost terrible, with hair that's both red and gold and shines. And even in this desolate frozen waste, she's clad only in a robe of sheer gossamer. She basically taunts Conan and says, like, "What are you doing laying in the snow? You should come and get me, big guy." And Conan's like, "Okay. Why don't you take me to your village instead?" And she's like, "Oh, no. That's where I live, way further than you can ever go. But try to catch me if you can." And she dashes off across the snow. Well, young Conan here, pretty upset with this, tries to track her down, but she always eludes him, staying just one step ahead. She flees out across the icy waste, taunting him the whole time to come and get her and claim her as his prize, essentially. And this just makes Conan PO'd, man. He is not happy, and he is not having this. So chases her he does all across the snows. When finally she leads him into a pass, he says, "If this is a trap, it's not going to work. I'm going to get you." And sure enough, it is a trap, as two giant towering figures rise up. They're clad in mail with axes. Their beards and hair have icicles frozen into them. Their mail is frozen over. Their axes are crusted in ice. And these giants rise up to essentially slay Conan. That's what I'm illustrating here today, if you can't tell. Anyway, the woman basically calls them brothers and says that they must slay Conan so that they can serve his still warm heart upon their father's board for dinner tonight. And basically, get him, guys. Conan immediately, without skipping a beat, launches himself at these dudes and quickly dispatches them and kills them both, much to the woman's surprise, who immediately freaks out and begins running for her life across the snows. Conan, now filled with like bloodlust after killing these guys in battle, essentially gains on her, and as he gains faster and faster, she freaks out more and more. I'm going to spoil the ending here, so be prepared for that. Conan eventually grabs her, rips that gossamer like robe off of her, and she calls out, "Father, please save me," when a blinding blue flash strikes down and she disappears, and Conan is left on the snows unconscious. He's later brought back to life in front of a fire. Another group of Aesir have found him, and he says, "What of the giants? What of the woman?" All that kind of stuff. And they're like, "We found no tracks but yours." You know, there are guys out there who go snow mad, basically. They get stuck in the cold and they go crazy and see visions and stuff. And Conan's like, "Yeah, that must have been what it is," until he warms up enough that his hands can unclench, and in one of them, a chunk of sheerest gossamer robe. Ooh. What a great time, guys. I love Conan. I love talking about this kind of stuff. I would highly recommend, if you've never read the Robert E. Howard stories by Conan, to grab them, especially that first volume. A lot of the stories are short, to the point, and freaking awesome. I hope you liked the drawing. I certainly had a blast doing it. I think it turned out really fun. I like doing this kind of more quote-unquote painterly style, I guess it would be, with the ink first. But yeah, I think it turned out terrific, and I hope you guys too. Until then, you guys, stay warm. Join me on the next episode. We're going to move away from our cold weather shenanigans here. I got some stuff planned up that I hope you're going to enjoy, but maybe we'll warm up with something a little bit warmer next time, you guys. Till then, see you on the next one. Bye.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of your women. That is good. That is good.